Hi, I'm Chris Bishop, the founding editor of Forbes Africa, and welcome to this CNBC Africa special. We're coming to you from Brussels in Belgium and the European Union Africa Business Forum. Now, this conference is all about investment and how Africa can get more of it. Attracting investment into Africa is no easy feat. If the European Union will spend 3.35 billion euros to attract 44 billion euros in external investment, there has to be some sort of blueprint to work with. So what is this investment plan and how will it be implemented? Robert Ridolfi, a former EU ambassador to Uganda, Namibia and Malawi, is the man who wrote it.
We had already a big presentation at the spring meetings in Washington. Now European Development Days is all about the investment plan. It's all about triggering development into the mainstream of investments, private sector, big money. To move the socio-economic transformation that African leaders are pushing, you need the right investments to create jobs that are sustainable and decent. Sustainable because they can be sustained into a green perspective, SDGs, the environment, the social, and decent because without a growth which is inclusive, your society will not be fair, will not be stable, will be not peaceful.
I think it is a very generous proposal. It is very kind of Europe to seek to plan an investment program for Africa.
External investment plan by the European Commission, which they announced yesterday, signifies a new thinking in the EU where they want to look at Africa as a partner. They want to enhance the role of the private sector, and they also realize that the traditional funding sources will not be adequate to finance the work going forward. So as a private sector representative, I think it's positive, but as they say, it's a plan. So the question is whether that plan will work.
The European Union is promising to put through the European External Investment Plan, and they're coming up with 2 facilities that will be dedicated to Africa, and they're planning on deploying around 400 to 600 million euros a year into blended finance in Africa to attract private sector investment. So they would be the #1 provider. The Swedish government, SIDA, is very keen on actually supporting projects in Africa, as are a lot of the other Europeans, and the USAID is also continues to be present in Africa. So these are, and I'm sorry, and I've forgotten, Japan in the form of JICA. These are the major donors that are supporting Africa in blended finance at this time.
The difference now is that they've put in money for that. We have discussed with the commissioners on these questions, and we have been told that in September they'll put 1.5 billion euros on that to help, well, let's say, joint venture between European Union firms and African firms, for instance, and also to help financing part of this private sector in Africa. You know that, well, within less than 1 week, there will be a meeting in Germany with the G20. Okay, so there is another program because I think the question, I think they are more aware of it, that the migration from Africa or from less developed country to Europe is because they are poor, poverty in the developing countries. But if you improve the living conditions there, if they can live from their work, I think they don't have to cross.
And that's where the investment plan of the European Union comes with 3 pillars. One is the investment, 44 billion. It's not enough, but it's not small. And the second pillar is, of course, technical assistance to work both ways. One side to prepare the investments so that the feasibility study is ready for investors to plug in, and on the other side to do improvement in the business environment. Many countries have red tape bureaucracy, legislations which is not conducive. I'm not talking only about foreign direct investments, I'm talking investment of the money that are in the country and money that are flying out of Africa. So the first objective is to keep money in Africa, invested in Africa for creation of jobs. And this, for the first time, as Europeans, I'm very proud to say, because I wrote the plan, we are very proud to say that this is in the interest of both people. It's not only a charity, it's not only a development action, it is an action in the common interest for prosperity and peace.
The key theme of this year's conference was job creation. According to the United Nations World Population's Prospects, Africa's youth population will be 10 times the size of the youth population of the European Union by 2050. So how can the continent put this young, growing workforce to work?
Well, I think, creation of jobs must be an objective, but it cannot be commitments at all. What I say is, if you want to get jobs, you need to have motivated business people. That means a business-friendly environment in Europe, because again, if you don't have margin, you don't go to Africa. So first of all, Europe must be a business-friendly continent.
A lot of young people that want to find a livelihood close to home so that they don't need to migrate. And what is our duty as a multilateral and as the Bank of the European Union is to help them to find a livelihood and one that is the types of jobs, solid jobs and fair treatment so that they can stay close to home and contribute to the growth, inclusive growth in their own countries.
As far as there is one people who do not have jobs in a family, it is a problem for me, so as minister. So I'm trying to find solution to all of them, but this is not possible because of the lack of means to deal with this issue in our country. So, but with the resource we have, we are trying to focus on something like 50,000 initiative of employment for youth per year, giving as objective to our agency. This is huge because generally for national agency in charge of employment in Africa, the objective is around 10,000.
People are more and more aware that Africa is the new frontier of development, as Asian countries has been, let's say, a few decades before. If you know that the raw materials are in Africa, most of the raw materials are in Africa. If we improve the human capital in Africa, and that's the big item, we can improve development in Africa.
Well, I think that, there's a long history between France and Africa, but only large international companies such as Bolloré or Bouygues or Total went to Africa. And I think now the challenge is to have SMEs coming into Africa countries. So what we do at the French Business Association is to bring delegation of business people from SMEs to Africa. Not only a business, but education people, institution of training and so on, in order to be sure that there will be a sustainable local development of business over there, but of jobs. We need jobs. Africa needs local jobs.
Creating growth without creating an inclusive society is not in the best interest. You will have social problems, you will have instability, and this does not take much longer to create a sustainable job vis-à-vis an unsustainable job. It takes that little due diligence that everybody should do following the SDGs that everybody has signed up to.
Can you imagine Nelson Mandela without an education, or Barack Obama without an education? Education is the key, but it depends on the kind of education that you want. You're looking for science and technology, looking for vocational training, you're looking for educated people who can create jobs and are not waiting for government to provide jobs for them. That's the Africa we want.
A big question here was, how is private business going to work with African governments to channel investment to create jobs? How does the European Union fit into what could be tough negotiations?
I'm expecting the European Union to listen more to Africa and to consider the priorities that Africa has and finance those priorities, and also to give an opportunity to the private sector players on the African continent to make a contribution to projects that are viable, that will help the private sector play the role that is expected of it in spurring economic development in the continent and addressing key issues such as the unemployment challenge that we have in a way that is win-win.
My expectation is that we are working together, that we are cooperating and collaborating for the best interest of the African population. And I'm looking forward that I meet a lot of colleagues, that I meet a lot of new partners, especially also financing partners, and that we jointly can also work with governments, because working for the private sector, I think it's key that we educate and advise the government what to do in the best interest for the private sector.
We are a bank. We are not a Mother Teresa type of institution, so all the investments we are considering should be of high quality, because the bank is a AAA bank. We can fund ourselves cheaply on the capital markets, but our shareholders want us to embark on high quality investments. It should be an asset to the country and the region, and not a liability ultimately.
The main thing that works are clear agreements between, bilateral agreements between governments, agreements between the European Union and particular governments, but also involving key industrial partners that can deliver on the projects. That's where we've seen success. Where we've not seen success in the past is the lack of that buy-in and the lack of clear accountability between the parties.
Now there is a particular chance for Africa. The G20 is setting their eyes on Africa. The whole migration issue within the European Union has made the European Union member states realize that it is better for us, but also for those that are thinking of migrating to Europe, to create development closer to their houses. When people are given the choice, very often, not always, but often they want to stay close. So it's a question of creating opportunities. And now is the time there is the political support from every side, and the private sector is starting to realize that there is profits to be gained from doing this as well.
Well, I think that I'll give some figure. We'll see that we are already on the best way for that. Well, if you take the National 5-Year Program in Côte d'Ivoire, well, from 2012 to 2015, we have a program of, it's a 4-year, the first one, of $20 billion of investment. 63% of this investment was made by the private sector, both national and international, foreign investors. Okay? In the new program covering the period of 2016 to 2020, it's a $60 billion US program, and our aim is that 62.5% should be made by the private sector. So the private sector is the engine already of the economy in Côte d'Ivoire, like in the early 60s and 70s and 80s in Côte d'Ivoire. So we know how to work with the private sector. And during my stay here, I've met a lot of private sector already here, from Belgium, for instance, and from other countries. And we'll have, by the end of November, in Côte d'Ivoire, the summit, EU summit and African Union summit in Côte d'Ivoire. And we'll have a forum of business in Côte d'Ivoire. And we'll gather a lot of them before the summit.
Well, as you can see, we're right in the thick of it, in the heart of this European Union Africa Business Forum. Do stay tuned in the second half for more views on how Africa can win investment. Do stay with us. Welcome back to this hive of activity at the European Union Africa Business Forum in Brussels, in Belgium, where in this CNBC Africa special, we're taking a look at how Africa can win more investment. With 54 countries in the African continent, making an investment into the continent requires careful planning. There is no one-size-fits-all. In dealing with the risks, you have to think hard.
Africa scares investors away. So we need to show that there are the right type of projects, that they will be followed up, that there will be proper assessment of the projects, and that the impacts that need to be achieved will be monitored over time.
One of the biggest problems in investing in Africa is just simply the risk, okay? A lot of the institutional funds and private sector funds is looking for a certain risk return profile, and unfortunately, the risk profile in Africa is relatively weak compared to alternative investments. For example, from an S&P and Moody's perspective, most of the countries themselves are rated BB- or B+, and most debt investors are looking at investing in higher risk, better risk projects than that. So we're trying to deploy blended finance instruments to create a financing investment profile that will attract an investor that is looking for an investment grade risk, because they're coming into a financing vehicle where there's other credit enhancement around the project to allow them to actually achieve an investment grade risk.
De-risking Africa should work, because what the private sector and potential investors have been saying for some, that it is very risky doing business in Africa. If you don't know Africa, the perception is that we are a very risky continent, which is not true, because the risks in Africa are just as high as any other part of the world. But I think this initiative by the EU to create a fund that will cushion the African enterprises and private sector from what is perceived as too much risk should be able to help us generate more funding to finance projects and investments that will be able to address the key challenges that we're facing at the moment. So I am hopeful that this will be done in a transparent way that respects the views of Africans in deciding what should be funded.
Now we are always working with the European Commission, and we succeeded pretty much in order to convince them what is the best way they can use their grant funding in order to promote the private sector. And so we are very much looking forward that we also can convince them to go one step further. What I mean by that is, first of all, provide much more money in order to develop projects, because it's the most risky one. Secondly, is also to provide some facilities in order to go for de-risking of investments, because the risk in Africa are still pretty high, especially with regard to regulatory risk and political risk. And the third thing we would like to convince the European Commission is also to provide some kind of first loss pieces in order to get also more institutional investors involved, mobilizing funds for Africa.
Yes, I think, the more you will develop a business in a country, the more you will have the SMEs and large, intermediate and small companies, the better you will be. And the better you will have a kind of rock, because economy means a rock. It's create a sustainability in politics. So I think the fragility of some states comes from the fact that business is very low or very fragile. So we have to develop and we have to invest for the future. And I think the young generation of people, especially in Africa, they are very keen on developing their own business. They are keen on digital economy. They are keen to develop very African applications on mobiles, like in Kenya with the payments on mobiles. So everything is our assets, and then, of course, the international, institution have to take care of some more fragile, be sure that, it's a continent. So we have to be careful that some countries don't fall into crazy things or revolutions, of course.
Well, I think we have to go on to pursue structural and sectoral reforms in Côte d'Ivoire. We have already done it in the past, and we have to improve it. In 2016 already, Côte d'Ivoire was among the 10 top reformers in the world, according to the World Bank report of 2014 and 2015. Okay, we are already eligible to MCC, the American MCC already, and also we have been eligible to what is called OGP, Open Government Partnership already. So, well, we know how to make the reforms. For instance, if we want to create an enterprise, a firm in Côte d'Ivoire, we need only 24 hours to create it. And we can make more reforms so that to make the environment friendly for the businessman in Côte d'Ivoire.
The Canadian government prioritizes Africa as the #1 geographic region to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. If you look across all of the major human development statistics, Africa is in the largest need, and therefore Convergence is deploying the majority of our resources to help out on the African continent.
Look, I think one thing that it'll clearly do is anything that provides more certainty in terms of financing is very important. I think that's the main aim. But there's also a big element here about, certainly in the frame of networks and connectivity, of sustainability, of building infrastructure that will sustain, doesn't need further funding. And that's also a very important part of what we're looking to do in Africa.
If you have a literate and numerate Africa, you can begin to process and imbibe technology and receive capital. Africa will then begin to become a manufacturing post, to begin to add value to its products. It will cease selling raw materials in their raw state. And the processing itself is what is going to give Africa its drive forward. And that depends on education, science and technology. And an Africa where there is borderless, where the borders that Africa was tied into in Berlin 1884-85 are slowly being disentangled.
It is going to work on the basis of a cash, which we call the European Fund for Sustainable Investment, Sustainable Development, sorry. This fund will be having two components. One is the traditional sovereign guaranteed big infrastructure projects. You need roads, you need railways, you need transmission lines, you need power plants, you need water. And the other one will be for private sector only. And that is on the tune of 1.5 billion, which will enable to guarantee investment up to 15-20 billion. How? Very often the risk of an investor creating a factory in a certain place can be mitigated by us coming with a guarantee covering first losses. Up to 10, 20, 30%, it depends from the risk, it depends from the country. Because we want to move investments even in difficult countries, where today investments is not taking place. Too easy to talk about, for example, South Africa and Kenya, but it's very difficult to talk about other countries. And we want to have a big range of investments so that good ones can protect the risk that we take in bad or more risky situations, but we need to give hope to these countries in very, very risky situations.
But will this investment plan by the European Union be perceived by Africans as charity disguised as investment?
No. In fact, the test is in fact that somebody may even see this as a reduction of official development aid. We hear in our conversation with the African leaders the word, we don't want charity, we don't want development grants, we want investments. Do like China does. Well, China does what they do. The European Union, we want to do as big as they do, but with our own values of principles of rule of law, human rights, democracy, environmental protection, social standards. It's a little bit more difficult, but it will be much more sustainable.
Africa will go from 1 billion inhabitants to 2 billion inhabitants. So there's a huge development, democratic development, which means certainly a huge economical development to accompany. So if we don't do that in Europe, if we don't do that in France, other countries will do that, maybe Indians or Chinas, and they will be right to do that. So I think it's a big opportunity, but we have to do it in a win-win partnership. Not saying, you know, I'm France, I'm the best, and I can give you everything you want. No. It's partnership. It's I can learn from you, from the African entrepreneur, the African business, because they do amazing things over there. So I think that you can motivate them by saying it's a huge country, huge continent, lot of countries, huge development. They need everything, and there's been an history between France and Africa for decades. But we have to forget the past. We have to build the future together.
I think that people have tended to see Africa from different perspectives. To King Leopold, Africa was a piece of cake to be cut up. To President Sarkozy, Africa had no history at all to speak of. To the Roman consul, out of Africa, always something new. For us, Africa is our home that we hope to develop and live peacefully. And we believe that a united, integrated Africa is a boon for all Africans and for the world. We have to work at it.
The beauty of the European Union vis-à-vis other partners is that we are not a bank. We are a political actor. We care about political relations. But in the political relation, in our global strategy, you will see that investments, the economy, the development are part of the toolbox of our relationship. So with the political relation, I was ambassador in Africa, in Uganda, and our political relations was triggering development actions and reforms that otherwise are more difficult. As you can see, you need a little bit of optimism, given by the fact that we are mobilizing certain consolidated mechanisms, acting with the right actors, not only 3 or 4 development banks, but many more, commercial banks and pension funds. As we speak, we are sitting on $8.3 trillion fetching negative interest rate. It's not an insult for you that this money is not invested in Africa?
Well, there you have it, some of the most influential voices in investment in Africa. The continent now awaits the results. That's all we got time for on this CNBC Africa special. From me, Chris Bishop, in Brussels, in Belgium, it's goodbye.